Alright guys, so I just want to show you a few different techniques that you can do with ink, using ink. First, I normally start out with 2 cups of water, one to clean my brush off with, and then one to actually make wash transitions with, and then I have my little jar of ink here. This will evaporate if I don't put a lid over top of it, and I probably won't, so I have this big jar though, so I'll probably use this again later. And you don't really need a lot of ink. It goes a long way. As any of you that have already experimented with it a little bit probably can tell. Alright, so I just wanted to show you guys a few different techniques that you can use using this ink as you get used to it. You can use either side of this paper. They're both pretty kind of rough. And this paper is very absorbent. This is called Arches watercolor paper. So I normally start with kind of a big brush. So there's a few different methods you can do. The first one that kind of gets a little bit looser and doesn't have as much control, but gives you some interesting like designs and absorption rate is wet on wet. So what that is whenever you first wet the paper, and then you work the ink into that wet spot. And it kind of makes like a bleeding effect. So you can see that I just took a dip of my ink and just the straight black ink. I didn't dilute it or anything. And I'm making this interesting pattern and design and bleed effect with this wet on wet technique. You can do the same thing by diluting your ink a little bit. I'm gonna use down here as a little bit of a area to test how light it is. Okay, so that's pretty diluted. And same thing, you can do wet on wet. So there's a lot of things you can do with this technique. And you can even just do kind of like a wash with it. And a lot of times what I do is, if I don't want black and I have wet down here, some like wet areas somewhere on my piece of paper that I'm just like testing my inks out on, not my actual drawing paper, I will like pick up some of the ink from that area, and then I know I can kind of do a light wash and it's not going to be black. And I always test my ink before on a draft piece of paper before I move it to my final sheet, just because then I know that it's not going to be like super black or white or anything, or too light. The inks will dry lighter than how they go on the paper because they get absorbed into the paper. So this area is still completely wet. I can kind of manipulate it a little bit more. I can dry my brush off and then maybe pull some ink out. And it is gonna kind of fill back in, but you can see that I'm pulling out some of this black, and I'm almost making this interesting like trail through this big area, that kind of, this big area of black value that kind of overtook that space. So that is the wet on wet technique, and also how you kind of create like bleeds. And I made that area really wet. It's almost was like a puddle. You can do it where this area is a little wet, but it's still kind of, it's not as wet as this was. So it absorbed, the water absorbed into the paper a little bit more. And now I have a little bit more control over it. I can still kind of create some interesting bleeding effect. See how it's kind of making this like veining effect outward. Looks like a firework is happening, but it's not like, it's keeping its edges a little bit more. The drier the ink, so the drier the surface, the more control you're gonna have over it, and also the straighter the edges will be. So you can see here, this is still really wet, and it's gonna kind of like bleed out a little bit more than this area would, because this has a bigger puddle of water. In this water over here, I applied a thinner, and it absorbed quicker into the paper. So that is the wet on wet technique. And then you can do kind of wet on dry, which I consider is a wet, when your paintbrush is wet with ink. So my paintbrush is fully wet and I'm just applying it straight to dry paper. You can see how dark that was. I dipped it into my water and it's still really dark. So I might dab off some of that dark, dip it into a cleaner water. And this is why I always have a test strip. as I'm working on an image. So say I was working on a large watercolor painting or ink painting right here, I would have my little test strip of paper over here to like test my values before I like went into it on the actual drawing that I'm doing. So that is the wet on dry technique. So you can see there's a lot straighter. The edges are straighter. There's more control. You know, if I wanted to, you know, write, say we'll make let me get that a little darker. A P for a page, right? It kept its shape. I had more fluid motion over it. I'll do it in this wet area. It kind of has that bleeding effect because the paper is absorbing the ink because the paper is wet. So less control with wet, but interesting marks. You can do, if anyone has water in their paintings that they're doing, using the water to your benefit because you're using water. So doing the wet on wet technique while you're painting water is a really interesting way to kind of keep like the water feeling really fluid. So I really do suggest using all these techniques. They're really fun to do. So then you have dry brushing. And dry brushing is whenever you take some ink. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. And then you basically wipe all of the ink off onto your rag, a lot of it. And then you apply it to your paper. So you have mostly a dry brush, and you're applying it on a dry piece of paper. So the area in this paper is not wet. And it kind of gives you like this scumbling effect almost, where you can see a lot of the texture of the paper, and you can do this on top of layers. So if you wanted to create interesting texture of, say, since you guys are painting landscapes like dirt or anything like that, then that would be kind of interesting to do. You can't do it on wet, so you have to wait till the layer is fully dry. So those are a few different techniques. You can also play around with using different tools. So I have this little piece of tinfoil, and I'm just gonna dip it right into my paper, and we'll see what that looks like. You can use a sponge, any tool that you can find. You can really make any kind of tool and play around with the kind of textures that it gives you. Same thing if I was to do it with this plastic. And it kind of just gives the same effect as the tinfoil. So you can play around with different things like that. This paper is really absorbent, so I'm not sure if this is going to work. But you can sometimes with this spray alcohol into the drawing, and it will make all of the ink around it kind of disperse. Let's see what happens in this dark area. And it kind of gives it like an interesting texture. See that? You could even use the application to like actually use the force of the applicator to make some, just blow that ink around. You could take a straw. I don't have a straw with me right now, but you could take a straw and like blow into the ink and kind of like create effects that it's like, you know, kind of like veining outwards. And you can also do that with a blow dryer if you wanted to. So something good to know is you can pick this ink up off the paper a lot. So this is a big puddle area. It's already wet. You can see that I can just kind of dip that in and it's coming right back off the paper. And I didn't wet my paper towel at all, but you can wet your paper towel and pick even more up off the paper. So see how it's kind of, that's another interesting way to create texture, is by picking the ink up with your paper towel. So you can also get your paper towel wet and then wet the area, re-wet the area. So this pea is kind of dry right now, so I'm going to re-wet it. And then I can go back in with another dry area and kind of pick up some more of that paint. So I'm going to I need a better paper, or more paper towels actually. And you can also do this using a paintbrush too. So let me get a clean paintbrush. I don't know if this is a good one or not. Kind of going over it, picking up some of that paint on my paintbrush, wiping it off on my rag, dipping my paintbrush in water, putting the water back over this dry area of ink, cleaning it off, drying my brush off, then picking that ink back up with my brush. So you can keep working into this and getting those, bringing back out some lights in the paper if you went too dark in some areas, even if it's already dry. It's obviously easier to do that if it's wet already, but you can just re-wet the surface and then pick some of that ink back up. So let's make a value scale using ink. I'm dipping this brush. Well, let's use a big brush. So I'm gonna start with black. So I'm cleaning my brush off. I'm dipping it in my black ink. And I'm making a black value. Now, what I can keep doing is just taking cleaning my brush off and then dragging that dark out. Cleaning my brush off. I always kind of wipe it out sometimes. Sometimes I leave it wet, but if I want it dry to have a little bit more control or to make sure I don't have any ink on my brush, like I clean my brush off to get that ink off. That way I know that whenever I'm using my water and dragging, it's going to get lighter. Because if I still have ink in my brush, it's kind of useless. Drag it out. Clean my brush off. Get all the ink out. Drag it out further. And I kind of went a little too extreme. So let's just drag some more of this ink into this wet area. So ink's really fluid. So you can do it kind of that way. You can also do it a little bit more like strategic, where you do one value, completely clean your brush off. Let's test this. Make like a mid or a dark mid value. That's too dark. Now bring that over, clean your brush off. Make a lighter mid value. So you can do it that way too. Let's see what happens if we make a value scale with wet ink. Or wet on wet technique, sorry. So I kind of just did a little dab and just dragged it the whole way across the paper. So something else to think about is layering and letting the ink actually dry. So this is, I was playing around with marbling earlier. So it's still a little wet, but it's dry enough to ink on top of. So I'm going to just pull some ink out of this area because it's still wet, it didn't dry, so I know I can use it still. And I'm going to just do some washes over this. So if you want it to be more transparent and you want to see these shapes still through here, you want to make the ink lighter, right? So then you can still see how you can still see the edge of that circle right through? Yeah, you can see the edge of this circle right through my ink. That's because I'm doing a wash and it's still really transparent, so you can see right through that. If I want to cover an area up, I just keep it a little bit darker, you know. Well, that's a lot darker, but you guys get the idea. Another technique that you guys can use is called marbling. This paper is a little absorbent, so it kind of like bleeds all over the place. But let me just show you really fast what marbling is. Now let me cut off a strip of paper. Alright, so let's move this for now. This is when you take a large bucket of water and you kind of make a design in the water and then lay the paper down on it and then bring it back up, and that will keep the design that you create in the water. So you want to take your ink, you don't just dump the ink in there, you want to take it with a brush and kind of just dab that brush in to the water. And I'm going to do that a few different times. And you can make like you could actually make like this target pattern. That's not the word I'm looking for, but that's what I'm going to use. And then what you want to do is take your brush or stick or your finger and kind of make some interesting swirls through the ink. And just kind of keep pushing the design until you find something that you like. Then from there, you take your paper, and you don't want to dip it in like this, like a net. You want to go down straight in it. So you're going to take your paper, dip it straight down, and bring it up. See how on the top it kind of went up and it captured that design? And it should capture the design that you wanted. Let's do it again. And then you want to put it on a towel or paper towel. But like I said, this is really absorbent paper, so the ink's kind of spreading. So let's try and capture a little bit more. Ready? Down and up. So it kind of is interesting. It kind of captures that like design pattern that you have. I'm not the greatest at marbling. Honestly, my first attempt when I did it with this paper, not my first attempt, but my first try tonight when I was just practicing, was better. But that is definitely something you can do, and it is definitely an interesting way to get textures. Like I said before, our Arches watercolor paper is really absorbent. So once that ink hits it and it's wet, it kind of does just keep bleeding. If you have less absorbent paper, it'll just stay on the surface more. All right, so a few more things that you can do. You can play around with different brushes. Where did the ink go? All right, so we have this fan brush here. You can play around with different brushes to get different techniques. I let this fan brush kind of like stay splayed out. Now I'm kind of doing more dry brushing. Let's use this fan brush in a wet area. So then it kind of like bleeds a little bit. You can take a toothbrush or, let's see, a stiffer brush. Here we go. This is a little bit stiffer. And you can kind of make a splattering effect with your brush. So I'm dipping it in the ink. This one has water in it. My first one was just ink. So the splatter is a lot larger if you're using it with water in it, because it's more wet, so it kind of like is less controlling. But if you have it a little bit more dry, so let's dry some of this off, and then you use it, it's not as like the pattern and the splash isn't as big. So that's just a few things that you guys can do with ink. So I suggest trying a few of these. Be experimental. I know that you're trying to get depth with your assignments, but also just play around with ink and all the things that you can do with it and keep it fluid and fun. And yeah. That's all, guys. Thank you.